a lot of folks, when they think about what's going on with new democracies, have very unfair, unrealistic expectations about what you can expect from recently transitioned countries. And if you think back at the history of democratization in Europe, and Western Europe in particular, I think you get a somewhat different perspective. That is to say that the history of democracy is filled with lots of backsliding, lots of failed democratic experiments, and teaches us that it takes a very, very long time to actually build stable democratic regimes. And that's because getting rid of all of the remnants of the old regime, the ancien regime, takes an awful lot of time. And so if we think, for example, back to Europe's first modern democratic experiment, which is obviously happened in France during the French Revolution, and you think about when France actually got stable democracy, which was really only with the Fifth Republic in the second half of the 20th century, you get some sense of the kind of timeline that early European democratizers followed. That is to say, it took over 150 years from France's first try at democracy to get stable democratic regimes. And so if you think about it that way, a lot of what we see going on in the world today, in Eastern Europe, in Central Europe, in the former Soviet Union, in other parts of the world, I think looks a lot different. So I think it gives us very unrealistic expectations about what to expect from new democracies, and I think we often draw from those unrealistic expectations faulty intellectual and policy conclusions. So if we expect, for instance, new democracies, especially those that have not had much democratic experience in the past, that is to say countries that are making their first transitions to democracy, when we see failures, backsliding problems, I think people have a tendency to attribute those problems or backsliding to flaws in the country, the society itself, and think, well, maybe this country isn't prepared for democracy, there's something wrong with its society, it doesn't have the right preconditions. But if we think about, again, how democracy actually developed in the past, we see that these kinds of patterns are fairly normal. They're often part of the process through which stable democratic regimes often eventually emerge, and really are more a sign of a country's process of eradicating the remnants of the old regime and very gradually building up the infrastructure of a new one, rather than a sign that there's something inherently wrong with the country or the society itself. So I think we tend to get too easily disappointed. I think we tend to therefore draw, for example, policy conclusions that say, well, maybe these countries would actually be better off under authoritarianism. They looked more stable, they seem to have fewer problems. And I think, again, if you look back at how democracy actually developed in the past, you would draw very different, again, both intellectual and policy conclusions about what's going on in newly transitioned countries. One admittedly unusual example, but perhaps particularly relevant given the part of the world we're in today, obviously, is the German case. In 1943-44, in the run-up to the end of the Second World War, a lot of people in the United States, for example, were debating what to do with Germany after the war was over. And there were many people, and you can imagine they got a lot of hearing at the time, who insisted that Germany was absolutely unsuited for democracy, that given the country's history, it could never be a stable, democratic, liberal regime, the society was too flawed, the country had too many problems, and therefore it would be better after 1945 to keep the country subservient, cut up, never allow it to have any sovereignty whatsoever. But a lot of people rethinking what happened in the early 20th century and after the First World War thought very carefully about the ways in which it might be possible to rebuild Germany after 1945 in a way that would help it get finally a stable democratic liberal regime. And so much of the planning that went into the post-45 settlement in Germany and in Europe more generally was based very much on trying to learn from the mistakes, particularly of the post-World War I period, and to rebuild Germany and Europe in a way that might help protect from some of the backsliding that happened after the First World War and construct a new order in which both Germany and Western Europe could be more stable than it was after 1918. So I think one thing that policymakers could do is to think carefully about what to expect in the short, medium, and long term. So over the long term, anything can happen, and even countries that look quite unsteady, quite problematic, can turn out, I think, over the long term to have many more successes. However, you have to think over the short term in building things sort of gradually. And so one of the things that's most important for building new democratic regimes, for example, is thinking about how to build the institutions that help citizens participate in political life in stable and regularized ways. So many new democracies often start off with things like mass protests, people out on the street, and things like that. And while that may be a large part of what gets rid of an old regime, it's not generally very healthy for new democratic ones. So very gradually building and providing incentives for the emergence of things like political parties, civil society organizations. This is not an easy thing to do, but it's one of the most important infrastructural elements of new democratic regimes. And so trying to provide incentives for, or the context within which strong, cohesive political parties and an active civil society can develop is absolutely necessary if over the medium and then long term you're actually going to get well-functioning democratic regimes.